Patsy. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me share my slide. Hopefully this is good. Okay, I'm just going to move my everything so I can see what I'm doing. Hello, everyone. Greetings of peace and love from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in British Columbia, Canada. I feel it's so important to acknowledge the land that nourishes myself and my family, and it has been stewarded since time immemorial by these nations, and they were never ceded. Thank you to the Culinary team for the invitation, to Dr. Piraz and Borghini and others. To be frank, I mentioned to Nicola this morning, I've never done a talk to a group of philosophers before, and maybe not all of you are philosophers. So I do hope that this presentation will make sense and that we will have the opportunity to have a fruitful conversation. So today I'm excited to share and discuss the role of unpaid food work in Indonesia and cultural approaches to food waste prevention and reduction. Okay. So I was raised with rice. Some societies are centered around corn or potatoes. Maybe in Italy it's pasta. But for me, rice is part of my identity as a member of the Sundanese tribe growing up in the island of West Java. I grew up surrounded by it as far as the eyes can see. But I also remember growing up and seeing the rice paddy being pushed away, encroached by mega malls, mega mansion, and urban development. From green, flowing, rustling rice paddies, we are now faced with tall buildings and sprawling development as far as the eyes can see. I did notice when I came to Canada that actually a lot of people eat rice. So when I teach a food course in Canada, and so when I started my class, I showed this picture and I asked my student, "What is this plant?" And many of them would just stare blankly. Some people will say, "Is it wheat? Is it grass?" And when I tell them it's rice, they would go, "Oh wow, I never knew that rice looks like that." Even though they all eat rice, and even though it's something that goes on their plate. In Canada, I keep chickens. And often people ask, how can your chickens lay eggs if there is no rooster? If you don't have a rooster, how do you have eggs? So they don't know that hens don't need roosters to lay eggs. And so I'm sharing these stories just to show how so many people, many of us are disconnected from our food system. And this is why I think it's important to talk about critical food pedagogy as it relates to formal food work, informal and unpaid food work, and also how it fits in the grand scheme of food loss and waste prevention and reduction. So at Simon Fraser University, I run a research lab and called the Food Systems Lab. And our research vision is to build a just and sustainable food system for all. And we carry research across the entire food system from the point of food production and harvesting, whether it be in the agriculture system, in forests, garden system, in waterways, all the way to consumption and waste management and beyond. And when I say beyond, it includes outer space, because I'm fascinated with research on food in outer space, which I think is a very philosophical research. And so today we will cover a lot of ground in roughly 30 to 40 minutes. So for today's agenda, I will provide an overview of the food system, discuss the role of critical food pedagogy, share my research on unpaid food work in Indonesia. And if we don't have time, I'm not going to go and cover this particular work, which is the student vignettes. But if we do have time, then I might be able to cover that. And just to give you a sense, in that picture, I'm conducting a waste audit. It's very glamorous work. So we're basically determining which one is avoidable food waste, which one is non-avoidable, which food it goes into which category. And the interesting thing about this is that we all come from different cultures. And so it's interesting to see us debate what should go where when we don't necessarily have the same idea culturally about what is food and what is waste. So that was an interesting experience. So the food system, many of you know this already, and often we think of the food system as the system and infrastructure needed for production, processing, packaging, distribution, consumption, and the disposal of food waste. However, what we often don't realize or don't think about enough is that the food system is not just a typical food supply chain or like what you think about supermarkets. the food system is also related to social and natural relations. The food system is also the sweat and the tear of the farmers, the mountains, the waterways, the sun. How many of us think about the sun as part of the food system? As Dr. Michael Carolyn noted in his book, No One Eats Alone, and that's because it's true. No one truly eats alone, because embedded and imbued within food are values, energy, systems, relationships. So what does it mean when we consider the true inherent values, the true cost of food? And so this is why worldviews matter. And this is why we're going to talk about this food pedagogy piece, because worldviews explain how we relate to one another and how we relate to the planet and how we relate to plants and animals. So how do we and how do you relate to food? So coming to Canada from Indonesia, I was taught by Indigenous elders that about the teaching of all my relations. And if you are from North America or from the United States, I'm sure that some of you might have heard of this teaching, all my relations. The idea is that we are all related. So you can be in Italy or the United States. I can be from Indonesia. We are all relations. And not just that. One thing that I was told by my Indigenous friend is like, Tammara, when we think of food, like a strawberry or a blueberry, that strawberry is also our relations. It's not just human to human, but it's also with the food. So it really got me thinking, if our food is our relations, and if food is considered kin, how can you conceive of throwing out your kin or just disregarding your kin? Similarly, there is a principle in Islam called Tawheed. And I think this principle matters in the context of Indonesia and the research Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim populated country in the world, with 90% of the population being Muslim out of about 300 million people. And Tawheed means unity. So this is based on the view of one infinite creator, one source, one singularity. And since we, along with all the animal species, plants, and the universe came from this one source, the idea is that, if you love the artist, then you should love and appreciate the art, all of the art. However, currently we are facing this disconnect, this like fissure, where we have lost our connection with the source of our food, with nature, with farmers, with the animals that feed us. And this phenomenon results in the loss of food literacy. So can we survive, if we ask ourselves as a society, can we survive without buying food from the supermarket? Is it possible for us to be self-sufficient? And some of us are, and some of us are not. And there's actually a conceptual framework that explains this phenomenon, and it's called distancing. So according to Princeton, the distancing process is the separation between primary resource extraction decisions and ultimate consumption decisions occurring along 4 dimensions, which is geography, culture, bargaining power, and agency. And the idea is that spatial distancing will also result in psychological or social distancing. And you can think about it not just in terms of food, but also in terms of our electronics, right? Our smartphone, our iPhones, and where are they sourced? So the primary resource extraction might be in the Congos, right? In the mines in the Congos or in Africa. And then the ultimate consumption is in Canada and the United States. And the idea is that with that separation, with that distancing, there's more opportunities to waste and to be extractive. So if we take that and we put that in the context of food, the separation between the source of our food, the point of production, which is the farm or the forest, and the plate, our consumption, there is also that psychological distancing that kind of like breaks our relationship to food, and therefore enables us to not feel as much or not to be as sensitive when we do waste. So in short, as Indigenous scientists Clarkson, Morissette, and Regalet argue, when we begin to be separated from the things that support our lives, such as land, water, nature, and the environment, we will begin to lose understanding of our responsibility and our kinship to the earth. So this is what they argue. So, but can we understand and fulfill our responsibilities to the planet and to the environment without basic food literacy? And what is food literacy anyway, right? So food literacy is proficiency in food-related skills and knowledge. And this is not comprehensive, but examples of food literacy include knowing how to grow food or how to fish or how to hunt one's own food, knowing how to cook and process the food. I went to a class one time and I asked, how many students knew how to cook. And one student mentioned, I finally learned how to make an omelet. And I'm like, congratulations, that's good. Okay, let's keep on going, right? So knowing the environmental, economic, social, cultural health impact of food, because for a lot of us, we don't really know what is the impact of the food that we're eating. It's all in packaging. Knowing how to adapt our food system to climate change, to climate disruption. How do we adapt? Knowing how to protect the ecosystem that supports the food system, like the soil, the pollinators, and knowing how to function in a closed loop circular food system that prevent and reduces waste. So these are just some examples of food literacy and environmental literacy. And before I go to my Indonesian example, I want to show you quickly an example of a formal school-based food literacy program in Haida Gwaii. And if you've never been to Haida Gwaii, I highly recommend it. Haida Gwaii is a beautiful archipelago in the province of British Columbia in Canada. So if you come to British Columbia, you can take a plane for about 1 hour and then a ferry to Haida Gwaii. It's remote. It's a remote island. And students at the school learn food literacy all day long. So this is a picture of me with the students. I love them so much. When I visited the school, the children taught me how to harvest seaweed. And then they harvest the seaweed and then they use it in their community garden box, in their school garden box to fertilize the soil. They also taught me how to identify crabs, where to find them. They know how to hunt deer. They know how to process the deer. They know how to fish. They know how to process the fish. They know how to garden and identify edible plants and medicinal plants, which is just absolutely amazing. And often when they eat, they would eat the food that they grow themselves. So they grow it, they help cook it, they eat it. They also have a compost system. It's a bokashi compost system. So they know where food scraps need to be composted, and then they reuse it in the garden and the cycle continues. When I visited, it was just after Halloween. And what they did was, instead of carving the pumpkin, they used edible paint for the pumpkin. And then there you can see that the pumpkin, instead of being thrown out, is actually being used for the school meal, which means, again, no waste. When I entered their classroom, food literacy, it was such an important priority in class. It was in the blackboard, it was on the table, the teacher was talking about it. They also conduct science experiments on food, and they learn how to make compost. So again, it was very interesting to see how the school was so entrenched in valuing food. And then I asked them, okay, so what's your favorite food? What is the food that you like the most? And I was expecting, pizza, KFC, something that's like, more common that I would be used to children telling me that they like chocolates, ice cream. My favorite is gelato, pistachio gelato to be very specific. But then they say their favorite food is kale and deer. And I was like, what? How many children would you go and ask, and their favorite food is a vegetable, right? Like kale and deer. And when they said kale and deer, they all started running around, pretending to be a deer, going around like eating the kale. So it was very cute. So here I just showed you very quickly an example of a formal paid food pedagogy. And so let's talk about the informal piece. So Nicola must know this off the top of his head because he does a lot of work on food waste. Just for those of you who are new to the field, food waste is a global problem. It's a major problem. The emission in terms of methane gas is basically 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And a lot of places, a lot of countries just don't compose or manage their food waste in a way that is sustainable. They usually just dump it in the landfill. So according to FAO, if food waste was made into a country, that country would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas after United States and China. And in Indonesia, in a country of almost 300 million people, the food waste generation is estimated at 115 to 184 kilograms per capita per year. And this is also a problem because of our very poor waste infrastructure. How poor? very, very poor. So when I started my research on food waste, a lot of people came up to me and said, why are you doing food waste research in a global South developing country? Aren't people too poor to waste? That was a very common kind of assumption, to kind of like, they wonder why I would be doing research in Indonesia. But see, in Indonesia, food waste is a ticking time bomb. So on the 21st of February in 2005, 143 people were killed in a landfill slide caused by not just heavy rainfall, but a methane explosion. So because there is no source separation, food waste and organic waste gets dumped into these open dump sites. They become very combustible, and the dump sites become unstable. And so basically people died in a waste tsunami. So the top of the dump site reach 1 kilometer to a village of waste pickers. And these waste pickers are not just adults. These waste pickers are children. And many of them would get their food, and not just like the recycling and stuff like that. They would get their food from these dump sites. So for me, it's a personal passion of mine because I want to see this addressed. But the thing is, food waste is not something new, right? Like, I think a lot of people think this is like a new trendy issue, but there's actually a lot of history posters about preventing and reducing food waste. It's been an issue since the World War. And I really, really, really hope that we don't have another World War. I do not hope for World War III. So food is seen as ammunition. Food is seen as an element of patriotism. Food is seen as like, food waste is seen as the greatest crime in Christendom. So like patriotism, war, and also like religion is weaved into many of these war pamphlets, right? And then there's also a popular trend of eating from snout to tail. So no part of the animal is wasted. So again, this is not a new issue. But nowadays, when we're thinking about food waste, we're thinking about, patriotism is not the issue. Religion is not the issue. Like, we're coming up with smart technologies to create packaging where you can touch it and then tell if the food is bad or good. There's also really interesting advertisements, like, really focusing on like humor, right? So it's like ugly and tasty. So you can be ugly, but tasty too. Anyway, the point is like people are going into a different kind of direction when it comes to advertising about food waste. And here's the one that I really like. It's really funny. It's called the Love Food Hate Waste campaign. And the Love Food Hate Waste campaign started in the UK, but it was also adopted in Canada, in many big cities in Canada, and also in Australia and New Zealand, I believe. So the idea is, if your face looks like a chicken, don't waste chicken. If your face looks like a broccoli, don't waste broccoli. If your face looks like a potato or an apple, don't waste potatoes or apples. And so there's a lot of these kind of like cute, funny commercials, trying to get people more motivated about not wasting food. But the thing is, when I think about solving food waste, and I've been in the policy field for a while too, and thinking about what governments do and what other organizations do. Oh, sorry, I think someone's unmuted. Okay, all good. So usually a lot of the solutions are focused on number one, awareness campaign, or number two, donation, right? So the idea is that to reduce food waste, donate it. Or to reduce food waste, let's like do these awareness campaigns and posters and advertisement on social media. But there's not a lot of research on unpaid food work. There's not a lot of research on kind of like food pedagogy beyond awareness campaign. And so food systems pedagogy, and what distinguishes critical food pedagogy from general food literacy, is that it moves beyond the knowledge of the ability to feed ourselves to actually how to learn about how to promote a more just and sustainable food system. So it kind of like takes the step above just average food literacy. And also for those of you who are interested, who may work with children or with youth, my team and I developed a toolkit called the Food Matters Action Kit that you can download from cec.org for the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And that has like about 90 different games, activities, and worksheets in in 4 different languages, French, English, Spanish, and Mayan language for our partners in Mexico. And that has a lot of activities to kind of like get kids motivated to reduce food waste. And then So as I kept on kind of like going into this realm of like really, really passionate and wanting to understand more about how education is weaved in, I came across this interesting special issue on the journal Gastronomica. And in an article entitled Preservation Pedagogy, Dr. Gabachia, and I'm sorry if I pronounce her name improperly. So Dr. Gabachia and her students wrote about the increasing kind of like disconnect and de-skilling of young people, and how in particular she remembers how, like, making jam, making pickles, that's just like something that everybody knows, but not a lot of students know how to do that. So in her class, as part of preservation pedagogy, she actually gave students an assignment to learn how to pickle and make a fruit preserve. And I found that very interesting. So you might be interested in checking out this work as well. And so I was like, okay, lots of formal stuff, universities, schools, they're all doing this kind of work. Let's think about unpaid food work and food waste prevention. So I'll talk about an overview of the food waste problem in Indonesia, what is unpaid food work, the types of unpaid food work, and then I will conclude. Let's just see what time it is. I think I'm good. Okay, so when it comes to studying consumer food waste in Indonesia, I want you to kind of, I don't know how many of you have been to Indonesia, but when rapid economic liberalization and foreign direct investment came into the country, a lot of things changed, right? So we went from traditional wet markets to major supermarkets. We even had Carrefour. Carrefour was in Indonesia, although they eventually left. Then there's also Walmart was there for a little bit. So there's something called the retail revolution. There's also rapid urbanization. And then in conjunction with retail revolution, rapid urbanization, economic liberalization, there's also nutrition transition because increasingly, while Indonesia is almost unrecognizable from the Indonesia that I grew up in, because, gone are the biodegradable banana leaf packaging and expensive rice paddies. It's really malls, modern supermarkets, fast food restaurants, as far as the eyes can see. So people are also increasingly living in apartment buildings where they are unable to raise chickens, to compost, to tend a garden, and food are increasingly imported into Indonesia, despite Indonesia having the most ideal climate where we can grow food year round because we are on the equator. So we have tropical weather year round. We have rich volcano-based soil. So I live around volcanoes, which is kind of scary, but well, I think in Italy you would know how it is. And and agriculture is now centered in Indonesia. It's still a big agricultural country, but agriculture is centered around commodities and raw materials grown and produced to be exported abroad, mostly to the West, right? We have beautiful rainforests being like cut down, deforested into palm oil monocultures. Again, for export for all of the candies and baked goods in the West. So with these rapid changes, consumption patterns have changed, and so has wasting patterns. And so the site of my study is the city of Bogor, a city 40 kilometers south of of Jakarta, if you've heard of Jakarta. It's extremely dense. And just to give you a sense, Indonesia is an archipelago of 17,000 islands. We have thousands of tribes, thousands of languages. So we are a very diverse country. And in Bogor, in West Java, 69% of the municipal waste is organic waste, but it's not source segregated. It's just dumped into those big mountain dump sites. And when I was there, they told me that the dump site had reached max its capacity by 2005, but 10 years later, they were still using it. So again, because it's dense and there's poor planning, there's not a lot of thought into, okay, we have all of this waste now. What are we going to do it? So it's very sad to see. But when I see WALL-E, the movie WALL-E, the Disney movie WALL-E, I'm very afraid to think about like how the direction of where Indonesia is going if it's not addressed. So unpaid food work is generally associated with practices such as the producing, procuring, preparing, and serving of food in the home that is not financially compensated. And the idea is that often unpaid food work is seen as less valuable. And often when one thinks of unpaid food work, one would think of domestic work, reproductive labor and work that is often gendered and revolves around the house, and work that in many societies and cultures are tied to women and therefore are stigmatized. And so there's a critique about the term unpaid work, the idea that there is a fundamental theoretical error in describing domestic work as unpaid, and it is the error of applying market concepts to non-market work. And you can agree with this critique or not, but I think what is important, what you can take out of this is it is important to recognize that monetary value is not the only values that would motivate actions. And if I go back to the teachings of all my relations, where even a blueberry is relations, if we think about the teachings of Tawhid, it's clear that there are different values and motivations that are non-capitalistic, non-market based. So spiritual values, so getting blessings, even if the blessings are not coming in the form of money, but is something that is metaphysical, that's value. Love between a mother and a child, that's value, even if it's not like, the kind of, it can be tangible, but it can also be non-tangible. And so there are various non-monetary reward that motivates people. And so the idea is that by kind of framing it as unpaid food work, it potentially reifies capitalistic approaches to work, and then stigmatizes or suppresses or pushes down, devalues the kind of work that is not based on monetary relations. And so there are many alternative forms of knowledge. There are many forms of informal unpaid learning, and the unpaid learning can also offer culturally sensitive learning that is tailored to the specific needs of the family or culture. So Houston argues that environmental justice storytelling, for example, that's done in many cultures, provides a framework for understanding multiple realities of environmental problems that are not necessarily discernible through policy or scientific practices. Storytelling and folklore often represent gendered, non-positivist discourse, and which has been carried for millennia by women. So women are the kind of the knowledge keepers, and so again, this is why it's important. So the devaluation of such alternative forms of education by women through positivist discourse is tied to the distancing of food and the viewing of food as commodity, that is commodity fetishism, rather than as an important source of building social and environmental relations. So sometimes I talk so fast because I'm so excited. So I interviewed 21 households consisting of upper income, middle income, and lower income households. And I also conducted a going along exercise. So going along is an ethnographic approach where you go with the participants as they go along as they go throughout their day. So going shopping with them, cooking with them, observing them as they waste food potentially, like, sitting down and seeing how they eat. So basically tailing them the whole entire day, which was really, really wonderful. And this is part of a much broader study where I also did a survey across 323 households and other things. So this is just kind of like a little sliver from the bigger work. And from the interview, I was able to identify 3 categories of unpaid food work that in some cases are quite fluid, meaning that sometimes they do kind of like connect to each other. And these are gender-based unpaid food work, faith, spiritual-based unpaid food work, and cultural-based unpaid food work. And to be very honest, the 3 of them are all connected to gender, are all connected to women. There were very few men that actually like really implemented this in my study. And so in terms of the gender-based food work, so I interviewed a person by the name of Rosita, and what's really interesting about her is that she kept on saying that, oh, I never really taught my daughters anything. I never really taught my daughters how to cook. And so that kind of is interesting because even though in her whole interview, she talks about how she gives them explanation, she answers their questions, she shows them how to do things. She kind of associates like learning with formal learning, and in a way she kind of devalued the important work that she was doing in effect to provide food literacy for her daughters. And so this informal learning is not based on a market relationship but on a social relationship, and it's not just that it's devalued by like outside externally, but Rosita alone kept on saying that, oh, I never really teach them anything. And then when I asked her how did you learn how to cook? And she said, oh, I learned from my mother, right? But so it's in a way it's interesting because the learning part is somewhat like detached or disconnected. There's the idea that formal learning is more valuable, even though basically there's been a continuous line of learning from mother to daughter to mother to daughter. But in the case of the upper income household, this kind of like line of learning can be disrupted because a lot of the upper income households hire domestic helpers. So because they hire domestic helpers, you don't have that kind of relationship because domestic helpers are the one responsible for cooking. And so therefore there is not this kind of like continuous learning as with the lower income population. And then next, what's interesting also as Indonesians transition in their nutrition with more prepared food, like chicken nuggets. Chicken nuggets is very big in Indonesia. You don't what do? You put it in well, we don't really have a lot of oven. You fry it, and we don't really often have microwave because it's very expensive to run microwave. But you know what I mean? There's not a lot of skills in making chicken nuggets that's already prepared. Another core value with the people I interviewed were spiritual values. And it did not matter whether they were Christian, whether they were Muslim or Hindu, because I did have diverse participants. When speaking about food waste, they actually would often quote scripture or bring in the concept of God. For example, with Inda, when I was speaking about food waste, she actually quoted verses of the Quran, and she would quote verses of the Quran to remind her kids not to waste food. She would use the Arabic term mubazir, which is a word that explains this wastefulness and extravagance and the idea of being compulsive. And the thing is, for her and her Islamic values, to be wasteful and to just kind of like throw food around is a sin, right? So again, this is not monetary value. This is like something that is metaphysical. And in fact, so there's this kind of like oral tradition that says that if a person kills an animal bigger than a small sparrow just to discard it and not because that person needs to eat it, then there will be consequences in the afterlife, right? So there's this kind of like future consequences, spiritual consequence for wasting even the life of an animal, because the idea is that all creation has rights and human have been given the responsibility to be good stewards. So in this picture, Indah would compost her waste. She uses it for the garden. She feeds the catfish. So she actually keeps catfish in her house. And the catfish, they eat everything. So they're like chickens and pigs. So you just feed them anything, they will eat it. And then it's very easy to take care of them. And finally, the third form of unpaid food work is cultural based unpaid food work. And this is something that I actually experienced myself when I was a child. So in my study, the women I interviewed, almost all of them would say that they would caution their children not to waste food by recounting this, it's called in Indonesia, pepatah. So pepatah is like a saying, please clean up your plate, if not, the rice will cry. And so I want to give you a little bit of the story, basically, of the crying rice. So basically in the story, a farmer was out in the field and she was about to go home after a long day at the field. And then she started hearing a crying sound. And when she was looking in her field to find that source of crying, she found a handful of unharvested rice on the ground. And so this story, the Sundanese Javanese story, is tied to this goddess. The goddess is her name is Dewi Sri. So pre-Islamic days, Indonesian had beliefs in gods and goddesses, and Dewi Sri is the goddess of rice and fertility for the Javanese, Sundanese, and Balinese people of Indonesia. And so this is a belief that predates Islam. But regardless of the fact that most Indonesians do not worship the goddess anymore, the belief still is that to waste rice is to waste the work of the farmer. The inherent value is that, because our identity is so connected to rice, it is just completely unthinkable to waste it. And so this pepatah and story has actually influenced my own choice to specialize in food loss and waste research, and is actually a direct example of how the unpaid food work of my mother, because again, she told me this since I was a baby, maybe not even able to speak. Although at that time when she told me, I used to remember feeling very sad at the rice, looking at it and like waiting for them to cry. So this kind of work by my mother, this unpaid food work, has motivated my scholarship and policy work. So, and this is something that the participants in my study kept on saying that they talk about with their children. So I think I'm not going to have time to really go over the other part of the study. I can share the PowerPoint with Nicola to talk about, because basically what I did, inspired by the preservation pedagogy, is I actually got my students to interview their elders. And so I'm happy for you to check some of the findings from the research that my student and I did. And it was part of a journal article in Canadian Food Studies. And my students had a lot of fun interviewing their elders, learning about how they used to preserve and take care of food. But just to conclude, the concept of preservation pedagogy as identified by Gabachia highlighted the need for reskilling, and universities and campuses can actually be a very important place and space to bring that reskilling back together. But also outside of formal places, food pedagogy can start at the home, and it's an important source of knowledge for prevention and food loss and waste prevention and reduction. Alternative forms of knowledge, intergenerational storytelling, unpaid food work, papata, those folk tales and saying, they also can be used as tools to diversify the Western approaches to pedagogy. And that can be through faith, whether it be different types of faith, through cultures, and to also understand that the domestic work that is done by women in Indonesia and other countries that have that type of gender kind of breakdown, it can serve to counter that mental distancing, as noted by Princeton. And then another thing is also that respect for animals and not wasting. One thing that I didn't get to talk about is that in many cultures, including in Indonesia, more parts of the animals are consumed, right? So like if you eat a chicken, you will eat the chicken feet, you will eat the chicken tail, like, well, not the tail, the back part. You will eat the chicken head. It's like more part of the animals are consumed. Whereas when I go to Canada and I go to a supermarket, the animals are all cut into parts where it's almost like you don't even know what animal it's from anymore, because the fillets and the whatever, you kind of lose part of the animal's identity. You can't see the fish head anymore. It's just the middle part. You can't see the chicken anymore. You don't know where the cow's tongue is. It's just gone, right? There's just the ground beef. So I think it's interesting to kind of like look into other cultures and see how different approaches to food might be. And then finally, traditional knowledge and informal knowledge can help with environmental mobilization. And so this is just something that I hope other researchers will kind of like look into and see how it might be in other faith, in other cultures, and kind of like contribute to the literature a bit more. So thank you so much. I hope I didn't speak too fast. And this is my email if you would like to email me and get more questions answered. Thank you so much.